purse, you'll need to get your 2-piece J's. I have one already sewn and wrapped around a D-ring, but I'll show you how to do it with the other one. You can just fold this in towards the center and then use clips to sew it in place, sewing clips. But I like to use double-sided tape. I also like to stabilize my connectors with a little piece of grosgrain ribbon. Let's see if I can get this to pull off with barely any nails. Okay. So I'm going to take my piece of ribbon and center it directly in the middle. And I'm going to need another piece of double-sided tape. And I will stick it directly in the middle of this. Then I will fold my fabric in towards the center and press it into place. So those center edges meet in the middle. And this is so much easier to sew than not using double-sided tape. But this one I sewed without tape, and I just had to be very careful. And I will sew on each edge. Then I wrap it around my D-ring. And I like to sew these raw edges together to make it easier to work with. Okay, on my exterior piece, I marked ahead of time where to put this. And I'm going to have this stick off the edge about 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to baste this in place. Well, I'm going to sew it over it a couple times actually, so not basting. And then the same place on the opposite side of that fabric. Okay, this next step is not required. However, it makes it a lot easier. If you are sewing with Decoville, it is a pain to turn this purse through a small gap at the end. You'll end up with wrinkly Decoville, and it's just kind of a pain. So I like to do a drop-in lining. If you are doing one of the smaller sizes, you also might want to do this because it'll make it easier at the end to turn all the edges in. So what I do is I have a running stitch across the top edge on both sides, 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the edge. And this will be a guide seam that I use later on when I do the drop-in lining. I'll do it on this side too. Okay, now I'm going to clip together these side edges on both sides. And make sure to fold the D-ring out of the seam so you don't accidentally sew over it, which I just did now. I folded it out of the way. Okay, if you are sewing with foam or with the turn through the gap method at the end, then you will sew this entire side. But if you are going to be doing the drop-in lining, you are only going to sew from your guide stitch right here down to the bottom edge. Now this is pretty thick right now, all my layers of vinyl. I'm going to make sure to sew over that again later. Apparently my video cut off when I was in the middle of talking, but I just went and I did another seam right along close to the first, and I made sure to sew over this edge right here where the connector is, and now I'm going to repeat that on the second side. Now that everything is sewn on the sides, I'm going to trim these edges. I cut off about half of the width of the seam, but then I don't cut off the seam at this point, and I can't really cut off above here very easily either, so mostly just cut up to this connector. You definitely don't want to cut off the seam next to this top edge that's not sewn. Okay, now you will sew this bottom corner, and so what I'm going to do is push this side seam to match up with the bottom seam. And if you're doing option 2, you don't have a center seam on the bottom to match it up with, but you can, as long as this line is straight, that should be pretty good. If you're using foam, try to keep the foam out of this seam. Now I will sew across this. I'm going to go back and forth across this center section that's got a thick seam. And then I'm going to just sew over this whole seam again. And now I'll repeat that with side 2. And I will trim this edge on both sides. And I am now done with my exterior. Now, because I'm going to be doing a drop-in lining, I'm going to turn this whole piece right side out, and then I probably will need to refuse a couple of the Decaville parts, so this will be a good time to do that, because then it's just going to sit on the it's just going to sit while you're sewing the lining, and Decaville always should sit after it's been fused. But if you are doing the turn through the gap version, just leave it inside out, because that's how you'll be sewing it to the lining in later steps.